In the heart of an old New England town stood the house of the Rileys, an estate with peeling paint and ivy-clad stone walls. Once resplendent, it had been left to decay for nearly 3 decades after a night that everyone in town dared not speak of. But Emma, a curious researcher of urban legends, saw it as the perfect subject for her next piece. Emma arrived late in the evening, the sun casting long, dark shadows across the cracked cobblestone path leading up to the house. A shiver tickled her spine as she pushed open the rusting iron gate, its squeal a protest of forgotten memories. She paused at the doorstep, taking in the air that smelled of mold and something sweetly metallic. The door creaked open at the slightest push, revealing a grand foyer swallowed by darkness. The beam of her flashlight caught glimpses of ornate carvings on the stairwell and moth-eaten drapes. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. What she didn't know was that the Rileys' tragedy had never really left. Emma began her exploration with the parlor, once a place where society elites would gather. Now it was a graveyard of shattered glass and sagging furniture. As she examined an old photograph, a sepia-toned image of a family with hollow eyes, she heard a sound behind her, the slightest hint of a whisper, too low to make out. She spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip, but saw only shadows. "Must be the wind," she muttered, forcing a laugh. The windows, however, were sealed shut, their frames swollen with age. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a message from her friend Jake, who'd warned her not to go alone. "Are you okay?" As she rolled her eyes and typed a quick, confident reply before shoving the phone back into her pocket. As she moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew clearer, but still indistinguishable. They seemed to come from the walls, carried on invisible currents. She entered what had once been a child's room, the wallpaper still bearing the faint patterns of stars and moons. A broken rocking horse lay in the corner, and a cracked mirror hung crookedly above a child-sized bed. Suddenly, a soft giggle cut through the silence. Emma's blood turned to ice. The laugh was unmistakably that of a child, echoing from somewhere close. She directed her flashlight toward the source, but there was only emptiness. She stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest, and that's when she noticed it. The mirror was no longer cracked. Instead, it reflected a pristine room with toys neatly arranged and the bed perfectly made. And in the center stood a little girl with wide, unblinking eyes staring straight at her. Emma's scream caught in her throat as the girl's mouth curled into a grin. "Why did you come back?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it sounded far too old for a child. Emma blinked, and the room reverted to its decayed state. The mirror was cracked again, and her own pale, horrified reflection stared back at her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Just an illusion, she told herself. The stress, the stories, it's making you see things. She rushed down the hallway, desperate for fresh air, but the house seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers followed her, their words becoming clearer with each step. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the hallway opened up into the master bedroom. It had a heavy canopy bed and an antique wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she smacked it, cursing under her breath. When the light stabilized, she froze. The wardrobe doors were now wide open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A shadow shifted within the blackness. Emma's breath caught as a figure stepped forward, a tall man in a suit with deep-set eyes and a grin that dripped with malice. The whispers fell silent, replaced by the deafening thump of her heartbeat. "You've come to join the collection," the man said, his voice as sharp as the edge of a blade. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. The scent of iron filled the air, stronger now. In a panic, she scrambled for the flashlight, but cold fingers brushed against hers. She yanked her hand back, suppressing a scream. The whispers resumed, this time a chorus of voices. "Stay with us. Stay forever." Light burst into the room as her phone lit up on the floor, Jake's name glowing on the screen. She lunged for it, grabbing both the phone and the flashlight, then bolted down the hallway toward the front door. The whispers screamed now, a cacophony of rage and despair. She burst outside, the cold night air biting her skin. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the house stood silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Emma's hands shook as she dialed Jake, tears streaming down her face. "I'm out," she gasped when he picked up. "I'm out." The next day, the local paper featured a small article about a researcher who had come close to becoming the latest victim of the Riley house, which, according to legend, claimed a soul every decade. Emma counted herself lucky, but she knew that the whispers, the giggle, and that chilling grin would haunt her forever. And from that day on, the house stood waiting, as patient as ever, for its next guest. Emma tried to move on with her life, but the events of that night clung to her like a persistent shadow. The whispers, the cold touch, and the man's predatory grin haunted her dreams. Sleep became a battleground where her mind replayed the horrors in vivid detail. And the voice of the little girl kept repeating, "Why did you come back?" Weeks passed, but the memories didn't fade. Desperate for answers, Emma delved into the town's archives. Dust-coated books and yellowed newspaper clippings told stories of the Riley family. Thomas and Margaret Riley, known for their wealth and lavish parties, and their daughter, Clara, who vanished one stormy night. Rumors of seances and dark rituals surrounded their legacy, but nothing concrete had ever been proven. One article caught her eye, a report from 1934 about a man named Harold Finch, a local historian who had also explored the Riley house. He was found 2 days later, wandering the town in a daze, muttering about echoes and a man who collects souls. Emma's blood ran cold. The description matched the figure she had seen in the wardrobe. Determined to find out more, she tracked down Harold's grandson, an elderly man named Samuel Finch, who still lived in town. His home was cluttered with artifacts from his grandfather's collection, old maps, journals, and photographs. Samuel's eyes, milky with age but sharp with recognition, locked onto Emma when she explained her visit. "The Riley house," he said, voice trembling. "So, it called to you too?" Emma nodded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "What did your grandfather mean when he spoke of a man who collects souls?" Samuel sighed and stood slowly, moving to a wooden cabinet. From it, he retrieved an old leather-bound journal and handed it to her. "Read this. It's the only account we have of what he experienced before he lost his mind." She opened the journal, the musty scent filling her nose. The entries began mundanely, but grew more erratic with time. Early 1934. "I heard whispers today. The walls spoke, but I couldn't understand their words. May 23rd, 1934. There is a man in the house. Not a man. A shadow with eyes. He watches, waits. He is the keeper of what was lost." On June 28, 1934, Clara Riley never disappeared. She was taken, and now he wants more. Emma's throat tightened. "Who is he?" she whispered. Samuel's expression darkened. "The Whisper Keeper, a spirit conjured by Thomas Riley's own greed. He wanted power, immortality, and the Whisper Keeper granted his wish at a price. It's said that every 10 years the house takes another soul to feed its keeper's strength." Emma's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The Riley house didn't just harbor a ghost. It was a vessel for a being beyond death, bound by an old bargain. She looked back at Samuel, whose eyes were now clouded with fear. "Did anyone ever escape him?" Emma asked, though she feared the answer. Samuel's silence was all she needed. She stood up, clutching the journal. "Thank you. I have to go back," she said, ignoring Samuel's protests. That night, Emma stood once more before the house, the journal pressed against her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She stepped inside, the wooden boards groaning under her feet. The whispers began instantly, an angry swarm of voices. But this time, she understood them. "You shouldn't be here. You don't belong." "I know," she whispered back, stepping deeper into the darkness. "But I need to see him." A cold wind swept through the hallway, extinguishing her flashlight. She dropped it, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. Moonlight seeped through a crack in the window, illuminating the wardrobe in the master bedroom. Its doors creaked open, as if welcoming her return. Emma took a shaky step forward. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice wavered. The figure emerged, tall and silent, eyes like pits that swallowed the light. The whispers became a deafening roar, and Emma felt them claw at her mind. "I know your secret," she said, holding the journal out like a weapon. "You need them to be afraid. Without fear, you're powerless." For a moment, the whispers faltered, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The Whisper Keeper's grin faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. Emma stepped closer, the journal trembling in her hands. "You're trapped here, bound by the same spell that created you. But I'm not staying," she said, backing out of the room slowly, keeping her eyes on the figure. The house seemed to react, the floorboards buckling and the walls trembling as if trying to close in on her. But Emma pushed forward, step by step, until she burst out the front door and into the night. The whispers faded behind her and the house stood still once more, silent and watching. Emma knew the battle was far from over, but she had something no one else did. Knowledge. And with it she vowed to find a way to end the Whisper Keeper's reign for good. The weeks that followed were a blur of research and frantic visits to local libraries, archives, and even long-forgotten town records. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had only uncovered a fraction of the truth. The Whisper Keeper wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was a manifestation of pure malevolent energy, born from a dark pact made by Thomas Riley himself. But Emma needed more than just fragmented journal entries and town gossip to understand how to break the curse. One night, as she pored over a collection of old town maps, a peculiar article caught her eye, an entry from the town's founding years. It was about a great ritual, performed at the house long before the Rileys had taken residence. The ritual had been intended to protect the town from a malevolent entity that had once threatened to consume it whole. But the ritual had been interrupted. The ritual had failed. The more Emma read, the clearer the horrifying truth became. The town had unknowingly invited the Whisper Keeper into their world. The very house that had been built to house their protection had become a prison, its walls a cage for the malevolent force that now lurked within. And worse still, Thomas Riley had come into possession of a forbidden book. A book that contained a twisted version of the original ritual. This book had allowed the Whisper Keeper to be freed from its original bindings, turning the house into a feeding ground for its insatiable hunger for souls. Emma realized that the ritual wasn't just a history lesson. It was the key to stopping the curse. The answer lay in finding the original, unaltered ritual, and performing it once more, but this time with a twist. The Whisper Keeper's power had grown too strong, and simply banishing it wasn't enough. It had to be bound in a way that would sever its connection to the house, to the land, and to the very fabric of the town. The only problem was, she didn't know where to find the ritual. The books had been destroyed, the pages lost to time, and the townspeople who knew the details were either too frightened to speak or long since passed. But Emma wouldn't stop. She had no choice. The Whisper Keeper had taken too much already, and now it was time to take back control. On a stormy evening, Emma ventured back to the house. The rain lashed against the broken windows, and thunder rumbled like an ominous warning. But she was determined. The house stood like a decaying titan, its dark eyes, the windows, glowing with a sinister energy as she approached. This time, however, Emma wasn't alone. She had come prepared. She had found an old priestess, an expert in ancient rites, who had promised to help her. Together, they stood in the dim entryway, ready to face the darkness within. The priestess, a woman named Isabella, held a bundle of herbs wrapped in twine, a circle of salt at her feet. "The ritual must be performed in the heart of the house," Isabella said, her voice a low murmur. "But be warned, child, this will not be easy. The Whisper Keeper will fight us every step of the way." Emma nodded. The house was quiet, eerily quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath, but she knew it was waiting. It always waited. They moved deeper into the house, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if the very house itself were alive. At the foot of the grand staircase, they stopped. It was here, Isabella told her, that the final binding had to be made. The priestess began chanting in an ancient language, her voice low and melodic, like a spell woven from the depths of the earth. The sound echoed through the empty hall, and Emma felt the floor beneath her tremble. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They sounded like the wind, like voices trapped in the walls, all speaking at once. But Emma focused. She couldn't let the fear take hold. Then, as the ritual reached its peak, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come to life. The figure appeared, tall, dark and faceless, with eyes that seemed to stretch forever. The Whisper Keeper. It moved toward them with impossible speed, its form a swirling mass of darkness. But Isabella didn't falter. She raised her arms, and the salt circle around them flared with a blinding light. "We call upon the ancient pact. We call upon the binding. You are not free." The Whisper Keeper hissed, its form writhing, trying to break through the light. Emma felt an unnatural chill, a pressure on her chest as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. The whispers turned into a single, horrifying scream. The priestess chanted louder, and the salt circle expanded, forming a barrier around them. Emma stepped forward, holding the journal she had recovered from Samuel Finch, the only remaining link to the past. She opened it to the final page, the one with the last part of the ritual written in faded ink. With a trembling hand, Emma recited the words, her voice barely audible, but carrying a power that seemed to echo across time. As she spoke, the final syllable, the room exploded in a flash of blinding light, and the Whisper Keeper let out a terrible, soul-shattering scream. The house shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering as the very foundation seemed to crack open. The air filled with the scent of burning wood, and for a moment, Emma thought they were all doomed. But then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The house fell silent. When Emma opened her eyes, the Whisper Keeper was gone. The house was still standing, but it was no longer alive. The walls no longer pulsed, and the oppressive energy had vanished. The house had been freed. Emma stood in the quiet aftermath, her heart still racing. The ritual had worked, but the price had been high. Isabella, pale and exhausted, collapsed to her knees. "We've done it," she whispered, barely able to speak. "But the house, it's gone. It's no longer a part of this world." Emma looked back one last time, her eyes lingering on the now silent house. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? The town would never forget the horrors that had once plagued it. Neither would she. But the Whisper Keeper's reign was over. The town was free, and Emma was finally at peace. The town of Elmwood had quieted after that night. The storm had passed, and the darkness that had plagued the Riley house seemed to lift. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something unfinished. Though the Whisper Keeper was gone, the house itself, now just a crumbling ruin, still held a strange weight in the air. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Weeks later, Emma returned to the house. The town had sealed it off, as they had done many times before, but Emma's curiosity gnawed at her. The house might have been empty, but it still held secrets. It was the only place she hadn't fully explored, and she had a need to understand. To know what exactly had happened, and why the house had such power in the first place. She entered through the broken back door, the hinges screaming in protest. The air was thick with dust and mold, and every step she took echoed in the hollow chambers. The walls, once filled with whispers, were silent now, but Emma felt an unsettling energy, a coldness in the very stones beneath her feet. As she ventured deeper into the heart of the house, she noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the dust. They were small, almost childlike, and they led up the stairs to the second floor. She hesitated, a shiver running down her spine. The last time she had been here, she had seen the child, the ghostly girl, standing in the mirror. Was she back? Was the house calling her again? Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. The footprints were too compelling. She followed them up the stairs and down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. When she entered the room, her flashlight beam fell on a sight that nearly made her drop it. In the center of the room was a figure, a girl, no older than 10, standing still, her back to Emma. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her dark hair cascading down her back. The same figure Emma had seen before. But this time, something was different. The girl wasn't smiling. She was crying. Her shoulders shook with sobs that Emma could barely hear. But the sorrow in the room was palpable. The coldness was back, and it was worse than ever. "Clara?" Emma whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She stepped forward, her feet dragging as if the house itself was holding her back. The girl didn't turn. She just stood there, crying. "Clara, I'm sorry," Emma said, reaching out a hand as if she could somehow comfort the child who had been trapped here for so long. The girl's sobs stopped suddenly, and the room went silent. Emma froze. Slowly, the girl turned, her eyes wide and empty. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her mouth was twisted in a grimace that was neither sad nor angry. But something far worse, something hollow. "You should have left," Clara said, her voice a distorted echo. It was the same voice Emma had heard before, but now it felt like it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around her. Emma took a step back, fear creeping into her bones. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her mind racing. Was this another illusion? Was this a trick of the house, or had something else taken hold of Clara? Clara's eyes began to glow, an unnatural light flickering behind them. "The Whisper Keeper is not gone," she said, her voice now a chorus of many voices, all twisted together. "He lives in us. We are the ones who feed him. We are the ones who keep him alive." Emma's blood ran cold. She remembered the priestess's warning. The Whisper Keeper might have been bound, but his power was not extinguished. The ritual had only weakened him, and now he had found a new vessel, Clara, the lost girl, and the others who had been trapped in the house. "No," Emma gasped, backing away. But Clara's form began to shift, her body contorting, stretching, until it was no longer a child but a monstrous dark shape. It was as if the house itself was becoming alive again, consuming her, molding her into something darker. The figure lunged toward Emma, a blur of shadow and rage, and she ran. Down the hall, through the crumbling doorways, Emma sprinted toward the stairs. Behind her, she could hear the soft whispers again, rising from the walls, each one growing louder and more demanding. "You cannot escape. You cannot leave." The house was alive again, feeding on her fear, on her confusion. The walls seemed to stretch, elongating, closing in on her as if the house itself was attempting to trap her inside forever. Emma stumbled as she reached the front door. She yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The house was holding her prisoner once more. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned back toward the stairs. The sound of Clara's laughter echoed from above. "You can't stop us. We're already part of him." Emma's hands shook as she reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out the journal, the very same journal that had been her key to ending the curse before. She flipped through the pages frantically, searching for any clue, any way to destroy what had come back to life. The journal fell open to a page she had never seen before. A page that wasn't in any of the previous entries. The writing was fresh, scrawled in a frantic hand. "The Ye House can never truly be destroyed. Its foundation is built on the blood of the innocent. The only way to stop the Whisper Keeper is to break the cycle. To end it once and for all. Someone must give themselves in exchange for peace." Emma's heart stopped. The ritual had not just been about the Whisper Keeper. It had always been about a sacrifice. Her blood ran cold as she realized what she had to do. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, the journal trembling in her hands. The words on the page seared themselves into her mind. Like someone must stay behind. Someone must give themselves in exchange for peace. The house around her creaked and groaned. Its walls seemed to stretch and tighten, as if it were alive and aware of the decision she was facing. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all demanding, pleading, threatening. The faint outline of Clara's figure flickered in the corner of her vision, her pale face twisted into an expression of anguish. "You can't escape, Emma. We are here forever." Clara's voice echoed, merging with the chorus of whispers. Panic surged through Emma. She had thought the ritual had worked. She had thought the Whisper Keeper was bound, that the house had finally been freed. But it was clear now. The curse had never been broken. It was just lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. Emma's breath hitched. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. The house had always been alive, always fed by fear and suffering. And the only way to truly end it, to stop the cycle once and for all, was a sacrifice. She had already come so far. But could she really do it? Could she give up everything to save the town? To save anyone else from experiencing what she had? The journal fluttered in her hands, its pages turning as if moved by an unseen wind. Her fingers stopped on one last passage, one that chilled her to the bone. To end the cycle, the one who started it must be the one to finish it. The house must be filled with the life force of a soul, willing to accept its fate. Only then can the Whisper Keeper be silenced forever. It was always Thomas. He had made the deal that cursed the house. And now, Emma had to undo what he had done. But how? How could she possibly understand the full scope of the ritual that had begun with him? She had no power, no magic, nothing but the journal and her will. The house was closing in on her and time was running out. She could feel the cold hands of the Whisper Keeper reaching out, pulling at her soul. Then it dawned on her. She had to end the curse completely. She couldn't leave it undone. She couldn't walk away. With a steely resolve, Emma turned back toward the center of the house, to the place where the ritual had begun. The staircase loomed ahead, dark and threatening. But Emma's steps were firm. The energy in the house crackled as if it knew the final moment had come. Clara's laughter echoed from the darkness above, sharp and cruel. You think you can stop it? You think you can defeat us? You're just a part of the story now, Emma. But Emma pressed on, clutching the journal to her chest. She had no choice. When she reached the master bedroom again, the air was thick with cold. The room was darker than before, the shadows hanging heavy. And there, in the center of the room, stood the figure of the Whisper Keeper, his true form revealed in full, his body a mass of writhing shadows and tendrils, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. You cannot break the cycle, he hissed, his voice an amalgamation of 1,000 tortured souls. I am eternal. You will never stop me. Emma's legs felt weak, but she stood tall, raising the journal high. The book vibrated in her hands, the pages trembling as if it knew what was to come. I will stop you, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I will break this cycle. I will end the curse, and you will never hurt anyone again. The Whisper Keeper recoiled, his form twisting and warping in a grotesque display. Foolish girl, you think you can rewrite fate? The house is mine, and you are mine. With a final scream, the shadowed mass lunged toward her. But Emma didn't move. She stood firm, chanting the words from the journal. Words of power. Words meant to undo what had been done so long ago. The ritual Thomas Riley had invoked. The ritual that had bound the house to the Whisper Keeper. As the words left her mouth, the very air seemed to bend and warp. The house screamed, a sound that rattled the foundation and made the walls crack. The ground trembled beneath Emma's feet as if the house itself was shaking with rage. The Whisper Keeper's form started to falter, breaking apart in a flurry of dark smoke. The tendrils of shadow reached out, desperate. But Emma held firm, finishing the incantation. By the blood of the innocents, by the souls you have stolen, I bind you now, forever. The house howled in fury, its walls shaking violently. And for a moment, Emma felt as though she might be ripped apart. But she didn't falter. The words spilled from her lips, a final act of defiance, as the dark power began to fade. With one final earth-shattering roar, the Whisper Keeper was gone, and the house fell silent. Emma collapsed to her knees, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the house lifting. She could hear the whispers no more. No more voices begging, no more screams. The evil that had once lived within these walls was finally gone. But as Emma lay there gasping for breath, she knew something had changed. The house, though freed from its curse, still felt incomplete. The ritual had worked, but the land had been scarred. It would take time for the town to heal, for the people to move on. But Emma knew she had done what was necessary. She had broken the cycle. She had ended it. As she left the house for the last time, Emma looked back at the ruined mansion. There was no longer any life in it, no shadows lurking in the corners. The Whisper Keeper was gone. The curse was lifted, but the memories would remain. It had been weeks since Emma left the ruins of the Riley house. The town of Elmwood had begun to breathe again, its people unaware of the true horrors that had once gripped them. The once foreboding mansion was now nothing but a pile of charred timber and broken stone, a reminder of the darkness that had once festered there. But as much as the town tried to move on, Emma couldn't. The weight of what she had done, and what she had seen, lingered in her mind, keeping her awake at night. She tried to return to her life, but the normal things felt hollow. The quiet chatter of townspeople, the peaceful rhythm of daily life. It was as if the world had forgotten what had happened. But Emma couldn't forget. She visited the local library often, researching the history of the house, the curse, and the strange events that had led her to the Whisper Keeper. She hoped that understanding the origins of it all might bring her peace. But as each day passed, she realized something disturbing. The house, the curse, it had never truly been vanquished. One evening, while flipping through an old journal she'd found tucked away in the library archives, Emma stumbled across a passage that made her blood run cold. It wasn't about the house itself, but about something else entirely. The Whisper Keeper does not die, and he does not rest. He cannot be destroyed by the hands of men. He waits in the spaces between moments, in the silence before the storm. He waits for the one who summoned him to return. The house is only a vessel, but the curse, it hasn't done. It is eternal, just like the Keeper. Emma's own sons trembled as she read the passage. Could it be true? Had the house really been the only part of the curse that had been broken? Had the Whisper Keeper truly been defeated? Or was there something more? Something that even she hadn't understood? The whispers she had heard during the ritual, the voice that had reached into her very soul, began to haunt her thoughts once more. The warning in the journal echoed in her mind. I see curse as eternal. As if in answer to her thoughts, a cold wind swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stood, heart racing, listening. There it was again, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. Emma. It was soft, distant, and yet unmistakably familiar. A voice she had heard too many times in the house. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Her hands shook as she grabbed the journal, flipping through its pages with frantic urgency. There it was, just a few lines beneath the chilling passage she had read. The Whisper Keeper's power lies in the echoes of those he has consumed. The ones who remain, the ones who cannot rest, they are his voice. They are his strength, and they will call to you forever. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. It wasn't over. The Whisper Keeper had never truly been destroyed. His influence lingered, alive in the very souls of those who had perished in the house, those who had become part of his eternal collection. The voices she had heard in the house, those were not just the whispers of the Keeper. They were the voices of the lost, the ones who had been consumed by the curse. And now, they were reaching out to her. The air around Emma grew cold, heavier than before, pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, their words indistinguishable, but filled with a desperate urgency. She could feel them drawing closer, like tendrils wrapping around her mind, pulling her back toward the place she had hoped to escape. She had been free. But now, it seemed, the curse had found her again. The whispering grew louder, each word clearer, as if it were calling her name directly. Come back, Emma. Come back to us. Terrified, Emma slammed the journal shut, the sound deafening in the quiet room. But it did nothing to silence the voices. They continued, echoing in her mind, scratching at her thoughts like fingers on a chalkboard. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet began to rumble, as if the earth itself was reacting to the call. The ground cracked open, and a dark, swirling mist began to seep up from the cracks. Emma stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror. The mist twisted and coiled like a living thing, and within it she could see shapes, shadowed figures moving within. Then, she saw him. The Whisper Keeper, not in his full form, but there, lurking in the shadows of the mist, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had thought she had defeated him. She had thought she had broken the curse. But here he was, calling her, reaching out to claim her as his own. No, she whispered, trembling. No, I won't go back. I won't let you. But his voice, now full of cruel amusement, echoed inside her mind. "You never left, Emma. You were always mine." The mist began to grow, filling the room, pushing Emma toward the ground. It was as if the very house was alive again, reawakening from the death she had brought upon it. Emma realized with horror that she hadn't truly destroyed the Whisper Keeper. She had only bound him temporarily, and now he had returned, more powerful than ever. The curse wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was something that had always been, something that lived in the very fabric of the land. And Emma had become part of it. The whispers grew louder still, swirling around her like a storm, pulling her toward the darkness. And then, a single thought pierced her mind. There is only one way to end it. With a final, desperate cry, Emma began to speak the words of the ritual again. The same ones she had said before, the same incantation that had bound the Keeper. This time, she knew what had to be done. To end the cycle, she had to give herself, her soul, her life. And with that realization, Emma knew what her final choice would be. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the mist thickened around her, closing in on her with the speed of an encroaching storm. The shadows shifted, the voices of the lost souls intensifying, as if they knew what was coming. They beckoned, whispered, and promised her an end to her suffering, if only she would surrender. But she knew what she had to do. Her hands shook as she opened the journal, its pages turning with a will of their own, as if it too understood the gravity of what was about to happen. She flipped through the cursed passages, her breath ragged as the words of the ancient ritual leaped from the pages. This time, however, it was different. Emma wasn't trying to banish the Whisper Keeper. This time, she had to end him forever. The voices pressed in on her, growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape, Emma. You belong to us now." Her vision blurred, the dark mist swirling in her periphery. The figures that drifted within the fog took shape. Faces she'd never seen before. Tortured expressions from long-forgotten souls who had been claimed by the curse. The sight of them nearly made her stumble, but she didn't falter. She had no time to waste. The ritual was simple, almost too simple for something so dark. The price, the sacrifice, her life. To sever the link between the Whisper Keeper and the land, she had to offer herself. Her soul, as the final payment. Taking a deep breath, Emma raised her hand and began the incantation, her voice strong, despite the overwhelming fear coursing through her. The words rolled off her tongue, ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. As she spoke, the mist began to twist and writhe in response, its movement quickening, swirling into a violent storm. "He be the blood of the innocent, by the will of the lost, I bind thee now and forevermore. By the life I give, the curse shall end. The Keeper of Whispers shall fade into silence." The mist began to churn violently, the air crackling with energy as if the house itself was alive, caught between life and death. Emma felt a burning sensation deep in her chest, the life within her being pulled from her body, flowing into the words of the incantation. Her body trembled as if something inside her was being torn away. Her very soul stretched thin. She fought to hold on, to finish the words, but the voices grew louder. They screamed, they pleaded, they promised her release, but Emma could not be swayed. She knew what she had to do. With a final deafening roar, the mist swirled violently around her, tendrils of darkness coiling into her body, consuming her. The pain was unbearable, 1,000 needles piercing her skin as the curse drained her life force, her soul. But through the agony, Emma's voice did not falter. The Keeper will never rise again. He will never claim another soul. The last words left her mouth in a ragged whisper, and as they did, a blinding light erupted from her body, washing over the house in a searing wave. The mist screeched, twisting in horror as the light consumed it, unraveling the very fabric of the curse. The ground trembled, the walls of the house shaking with an intensity Emma had never felt before. The force of the light was too much for the house to contain. The screams of the lost souls, the whispers of the Keeper, they faded. The house itself began to crumble, its foundations shaking as if it could no longer hold the terrible power that had once been bound to it. And then, everything went silent. The light faded, and Emma fell to her knees, her body limp with exhaustion. The mist was gone. The whispers had ceased. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No voices, no shadows, no lingering darkness. The curse had ended, but at a great cost. Emma felt herself slipping away, the world around her fading into blackness. Her chest tightened, and she realized, truly realized, that she was no longer of this world. She had given everything. Her soul was no longer hers to claim. The ritual had worked, but in doing so, it had claimed her life, her essence, as payment for the peace she had wrought. But as she collapsed to the ground, her eyes closing for the last time, there was no fear in her heart. She had done what she needed to do. She had ended the cycle, ended the curse. The Whisper Keeper would never rise again, and the souls he had stolen would finally be free. And as Emma drifted into the void, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. The sound of silence. The house, the land, the people. It was all at peace. At last, Emma's eyes fluttered open, though she didn't know where she was. The world around her was dark, unnaturally so. She could feel a soft, oppressive weight pressing against her, yet it didn't feel like the pain of the curse's final grasp. It felt distant, like she had been removed from the world she knew. The last thing she remembered was the overwhelming light, the voices fading, the house crumbling. Had it worked? Had she truly defeated the Whisper Keeper? Emma. The voice was faint, like a whisper carried on a breeze, but it was familiar. She strained to listen, trying to place it. Emma, you think this is over? Her heart stopped. The voice. It couldn't be. Clara, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, lost in the dark. But there was no answer. The darkness felt heavier now, colder, as if it were alive. She tried to move, to stand, but her limbs felt like they were made of stone, bound to the ground beneath her. And then it came, the sensation of being watched. Emma felt eyes on her, a presence so immense and consuming that it made her skin crawl. It wasn't the Whisper Keeper. It was something else, something far older, more ancient. She gasped. Had she truly escaped? The air around her began to shimmer, and with that shimmer came the faintest flicker of a vision. There was a figure, just a shadow at first, but as it took form, Emma's breath hitched. It was Clara. Clara's form was translucent, her eyes hollow. Her face twisted in a way Emma had never seen. She looked wrong, as if her body was trying to hold together but couldn't. You didn't think you could just end it, did you? Clara's voice was distant, echoing in Emma's mind. It wasn't the voice of her old friend, but something darker, something more malevolent. The Keeper, the curse, it's never truly gone. You should have known. You are still bound to us. Emma's heart sank as the realization hit. The price she had paid, the ritual she had completed, it hadn't just been to free the town or to stop the Keeper. It had also sealed her fate. She had given herself not only to end the curse, but to become part of it. And now the spirits of the house, the ones consumed by the curse, were calling out to her, claiming her as one of their own. Why? Emma whispered, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Why didn't you tell me? Clara's expression shifted, twisting into something almost pitying. You had to make the choice. It's the way of things. The curse cannot be undone by mere mortals. It's woven into the fabric of this land, and you, like all the others before you, are just a piece in the puzzle. Your sacrifice didn't break the curse. It only gave it a new form. Emma's mind raced. A new form. Her gaze darted around the dark, but there was no escape. The world felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very nature of reality was bending in ways it shouldn't. Suddenly, she felt something cold and sharp brush against her skin. She recoiled, but it was already too late. The darkness had taken hold of her, and before she could react, the shadow of Clara lunged forward, her ghostly hands grabbing Emma's arms, pulling her deeper into the void. Clara, no, Emma cried out, her voice hoarse. This isn't you. You're trapped in here just like me. But Clara's grip tightened. The cold, empty eyes of her friend burned into Emma's soul, and the last remnants of hope drained from her heart. Clara had never truly been freed. She had always been part of the curse, a lost soul claimed by the Whisper Keeper. And now, Clara wasn't here to help her. She was here to drag her into the darkness. "I wasn't the one who freed you, Emma," Clara whispered, her voice filled with malice. "You were." The darkness closed in faster, swirling around Emma until she could barely breathe. The last thing she saw before the world went black was Clara's haunting, twisted face and the swirling mist that consumed everything. Unbreakable cycling, Emma awoke with a start, her body jolting upright. She was no longer in the void. She was back in the Riley house, the same house she had thought she had destroyed. Her breath was shallow, and her heart pounded. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as she looked around, she saw it. The familiar, crumbling walls, the broken furniture, the shadows creeping along the corners. The house was alive again, and with it, the curse. No. Emma gasped, rising to her feet. She tried to run, but the house seemed to stretch before her, its hallways endlessly long, the doorways leading to nothing but more darkness. She could feel the presence of the Whisper Keeper growing stronger. She wasn't free. She had never been free. The truth sank in like a heavy stone in her chest. The curse was eternal. The house, the Keeper, the souls bound to it. They could never truly be destroyed. Each cycle began anew, and Emma, whether she liked it or not, was now a part of that cycle. She had broken one chain only to find herself shackled to another. The voices whispered again. They were faint at first, distant murmurs, but they grew louder and clearer and closer. Emma felt the weight of their gaze upon her. She tried to fight, to scream, but it was pointless. The house was its own entity, and it had already claimed her. The Whisper Keeper had found a new vessel for his torment, and Emma was the key. She had thought she could break free, but in truth she had only sealed her place in an unending cycle of horror. As the voices swirled around her, Emma knew one painful truth. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how many lives she sacrificed, the curse would never die. And neither would she. Emma stood frozen in the heart of the Riley house, her breath shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with the whispers of the lost souls trapped within the walls. They called to her, their voices a cacophony of pain and pleading. The oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her, suffocating her. And for the first time since she had set foot in the mansion, Emma realized with chilling clarity she would never escape. The mist had returned, swirling at the edges of her vision, a constant reminder of the curse she had foolishly thought she could break. It moved in slow, deliberate tendrils, its cold embrace reaching out for her, as if it were alive. She wanted to scream, to run, but the very air was thick with an invisible force that held her in place. Her mind raced with desperation. No, this can't be happening. I destroyed the house. I freed the souls. I gave everything. But the truth was inescapable. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, thinking she could sever the curse with a single, selfless act. But in doing so, she had only strengthened it. The Whisper Keeper had not been vanquished. He had simply been set free from the chains that had bound him to the house. And now, Emma herself was the final link, the one who had allowed his return, the one who had fed the curse with her very soul. "You can never escape, Emma," a voice murmured from the shadows. She turned, her heart lurching in her chest. Clara's form emerged from the darkness, but it was not the Clara she had known. The face that now stared at her was gaunt, twisted, hollow-eyed, a mere echo of the girl she had once called a friend. The curse had twisted Clara's spirit, just as it had twisted so many others before her. "Clara, I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, but her friend's expression remained cold and unreadable. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Clara's lips curled into a twisted, sorrowful smile. "You were always meant to be here, Emma. You were never going to escape, not after you made the choice." Emma's breath caught in her throat. I thought I could end it. I thought." "You were wrong," Clara interrupted, her voice growing colder with each word. "The curse has always been here, Emma. Always. The house, the Keeper, They were just a part of it. You've always been a part of it. You can't break what is eternal. Emma's eyes filled with tears as the weight of Clara's words sank in. The guilt, the regret, it was overwhelming. She had thought she had freed Clara, freed the others, but in reality she had merely replaced one prison with another. The cycle had only begun again, and she was trapped in it, just as Clara had been. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered again, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Clara stepped closer, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "Sorry doesn't matter anymore. You're one of us now. You always were." The ground beneath Emma's feet seemed to tremble, the air thick with the presence of the Whisper Keeper. He was close now, his energy suffusing the very walls of the house. Emma could feel his gaze upon her, his attention like a burning flame. She could hear his laughter, a low, guttural sound that rumbled through the very fabric of her being. She had failed, and now the house would claim her. The walls seemed to close in around her as the house itself came alive. The very floor beneath her feet shifted, becoming a writhing, pulsing mass of shadows. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, no longer distant murmurs but maddening howls that filled her ears. "No!" Emma screamed, her voice cracking. She tried to push against the encroaching darkness, but it was futile. The shadows were everywhere, pulling her, suffocating her. "I can't! Don't! Please!" But there was no escape. As the darkness enveloped her, she felt the curse claim her once again. The Whisper Keeper's voice filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "You are mine now, Emma, forever." And then, there was nothing. When the sun rose over Elmwood the next day, the town appeared untouched. The Riley house, however, was different. The once charred ruins had vanished, as if they had never been there at all. In their place stood a decrepit mansion, its windows dark and lifeless. But something lingered in the air, a sense of unease, of something unfinished. And in the quietest corners of the town, people whispered about the strange feeling that had settled over them. Some said it was just the wind, but others knew better. Every now and then, when the night was particularly still, someone would hear the faintest sound like a whisper on the edge of hearing, calling them by name. And some, foolish or desperate, would follow that voice, led by an unseen force into the darkness, never to be seen again. But the house, the curse, and the Whisper Keeper, these things never left. They waited. Always. Days turned into weeks, and the town of Elmwood slowly began to forget. Life went on as it always had, with no sign of the terror that had once consumed it. The Riley house, rebuilt from the ashes, stood tall and silent. It loomed over the town like a forgotten ghost, its windows dark, its doors shut tight. Yet, the whispers continued. Faint at first, they were soon drowned out by the mundane noise of daily life. But those who listened carefully could still hear them, faint murmurs carried on the wind, voices that weren't their own. Mara Jennings was one such person. She had grown up in Elmwood, and despite the unsettling reputation of the Riley house, she had always been curious. As a child, she'd heard the stories, the ones about the cursed house, the Whisper Keeper, the souls trapped within its walls. And though she'd never believed them, a part of her wondered what it would be like to enter, to face the darkness that had once claimed so many. One autumn evening, long after the last rays of sunlight had faded behind the hills, Mara stood at the edge of the Riley house grounds. The air was thick with fog, rolling in from the forest that surrounded the property. The house stood before her, as imposing as ever. Its windows reflected the pale light of the moon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift. Mara knew she shouldn't go in. She had heard the rumors. The locals spoke of strange occurrences, footsteps in the night, lights flickering in empty rooms, and eerie sounds that echoed through the town. But Mara was determined. The house had a pull on her, something deeper than curiosity. There was something unfinished about it, something that called to her from within the walls. She took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted gate, stepping onto the grounds. The air was colder here, a biting chill that made her shiver despite her thick jacket. She walked up the cracked path, each step seeming to echo louder than the last, until she reached the front door. It was ajar. Mara hesitated for a moment, the weight of her decision settling in her chest. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told her about the house, the warnings about the cursed souls trapped inside. But curiosity outweighed her fear. She stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind her. The inside of the house was even colder than the outside. The air smelled of dust and decay, and the once grand wooden floors were now warped and splintered. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs filled every corner. Despite the passage of time, the house still held its oppressive presence, as if the memories of its dark past had seeped into every surface. As Mara ventured further into the house, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a breeze brushing her ear, but they grew louder, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, clear and sharp, filled with anguish and despair. "Help us. Get out. Don't stay." Mara stopped, her heart racing. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions, wrapping around her like a web. She wanted to leave, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness ahead of her. And then, she saw him, the Whisper Keeper. He stood at the far end of the hallway, his form shifting in and out of the shadows, his eyes dark and endless, locked onto hers, and she felt the air in the room grow heavier. The house seemed to pulse with his presence, its walls groaning in response. "You shouldn't have come." His voice was low, echoing in her mind. "You've awakened what should have stayed buried." Mara's breath caught in her throat. I don't understand. Who are you?" The Whisper Keeper's form flickered, his face contorting into a grotesque mask. "I am the one who watches, the one who waits. The house calls to those like you, Mara. It always has." The name sent a chill down her spine. How did he know her name? "You're part of this," the Whisper Keeper continued, his voice dripping with malevolent joy. "You always have been. The curse that binds this place, the curse that binds me, is a part of you now. Just as it was a part of Emma, of Clara." Mara's head spun. Yemma, Clara. She had heard those names before, but the connection was unclear, vague. All she knew was that the curse had never truly been broken. It had only waited for someone like her, someone with the same darkness in their heart, to walk through its doors. "No," Mara whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not like them. I'm not part of this." The Whisper Keeper's laughter filled the air, a cold, hollow sound. "You don't have a choice, Mara. The house has chosen you, just as it chose them." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The house groaned, its walls shaking as if something deep inside was awakening. The whispers grew louder, frantic, and the air around her began to swirl with a force she couldn't understand. The Whisper Keeper stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a sickly, ethereal light. "You will be the last," he said. "The final offering. Your soul will feed the house, and the cycle will begin again." Mara stumbled back, her heart racing as she turned to flee. But the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the walls seemed to close in, trapping her. She was trapped. With a final, guttural cry, the Whisper Keeper reached out for her. Mara's body froze, her chest tightening as his shadow enveloped her. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, and she could feel the curse wrapping around her soul, pulling her into the depths of the house. But in her final moments, Mara realized the truth. There was no escaping this place. There never had been. The next morning, when the sun rose over Elmwood, no one noticed the absence of Mara Jennings. She had disappeared, like so many before her. The Riley house stood as it always had, a silent monument to the darkness that lived within it. But deep inside, the whispers stirred once more, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, too curious. The cycle continued. Mara's disappearance did not go unnoticed for long. As the days passed and she failed to return home, concern began to ripple through the town of Elmwood. Her parents, desperate and frantic, filed a missing person report. The police began their search, but no trace of Mara was ever found. Her friends were left with only questions that echoed through the empty streets, unanswered. But the Riley house stood as it always had, silent and watchful, as if it had never been touched. The whispers had quieted, but there was something else in the air, an unsettling stillness. People avoided the house now more than ever, crossing to the other side of the street when they walked past, casting furtive glances at the decaying mansion as they hurried on their way. No one spoke of it aloud, that the house had become a presence, a dark specter over Elmwood. Its history had become a ghost that lingered in the town's memories. One evening, weeks after Mara had vanished, a man named Peter Blake moved into town. He was an outsider, a writer looking for inspiration for his next novel. He had heard the rumors about the Riley house, the whispers that had faded into local folklore, and he found himself intrigued by it. What kind of place would drive a town to keep its distance? What stories lay hidden in those dark walls? Against the warnings of the townsfolk, Peter made his way toward the house, determined to learn its secrets. The air was thick with fog, and the wind howled as he approached the front gate. The house loomed over him, its silhouette jagged against the dimming sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. But Peter was undeterred. He had faced darker things in his life, things that no ordinary man should dare to face. And he would uncover whatever this house had to offer. He pushed open the rusted gate, which creaked eerily in protest, and stepped onto the grounds. The wind seemed to grow colder as he approached the front door, which stood ajar, just as it had when Mara entered. There was something familiar about it, something that seemed to pull him forward, despite the voice in the back of his mind that warned him to turn back. With a deep breath, Peter entered. The house was as he had imagined, dark, decaying, and unnervingly quiet. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way through the dark hallway. Dust covered the surfaces and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains in the corners. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. But it was the eyes that caught his attention. Everywhere he looked, there seemed to be eyes. Paintings with lifeless gazes, cracked mirrors that reflected distorted versions of himself. And in the dark corners of the house, he swore he saw shadows move, watching him with a cold intensity. The further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thicker, colder, and the house seemed to shift around him, groaning like it was alive. Peter's heart began to race. He knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. But his curiosity pushed him forward. He had to see it through. He had to understand what happened here. As he moved deeper into the house, the whispers started. Soft at first, like a breeze carrying fragments of words. But then they grew louder, more distinct. It was a chorus of voices, low and mournful, echoing through the walls. He couldn't make out the words, but the sense of desperation in them was unmistakable. Help us. Leave. Don't stay. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the source of the voices, feeling an overwhelming pull toward the far end of the house. The hallway stretched before him, and at its end, he saw a faint light flickering through a partially open door. It was a dim, unnatural glow, like something that should not be. Despite the overwhelming fear clawing at his chest, Peter walked toward it. He pushed open the door, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The room was small and bare, with only a single chair in the center. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, their meaning lost to time. And in the center of the room, standing motionless, was the figure of a woman. She was thin, pale, with dark, hollow eyes that stared at him unblinking. Peter froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who she was, but he could feel the coldness emanating from her. Her presence filled the room, suffocating him. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice like the wind through dead leaves. "You're too late." Peter took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the room. His pulse quickened as the walls seemed to close in around him. He turned back to the woman, but she was gone. In her place stood the Whisper Keeper. His form was no longer shadowy or fleeting. He was solid, towering, his eyes black and endless, like two voids that swallowed all light. The house seemed to pulse around him, alive with energy, as if it were feeding off his fear. "You are the next Peter Blake," the Whisper Keeper intoned, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. "You've awakened what you cannot comprehend. This house, this curse, it is eternal. And now you are part of it." Peter's body went cold as he realized the truth. Mara had not been the first to fall victim. He had walked into a trap, a cycle of torment that had claimed countless souls before him. The house, The curse, the keeper. These were not just tales. They were real. His body trembled as the floor beneath him seemed to give way. The room stretched and warped, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. "No," Peter shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of whispers. He clawed at the walls, his fingers scraping against the rotting wood, but there was no escape. The darkness had him now, just as it had claimed Mara and countless others before her. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the flickering light of the house souls, endlessly hungry, endlessly waiting. Days later, the townsfolk of Elmwood noticed the house had changed once again. The windows were darker, and the air felt heavier. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, and though no one spoke of it, everyone knew that something new had entered the Riley house. Peter Blake's name joined the others on the list of those who had vanished, and in the silence of the night, the house waited patiently for its next visitor, its next victim. For the curse would never end. The cycle would never break. The house always wins. It had been months since Peter Blake had vanished without a trace, his disappearance another addition to the eerie history of the Riley house. And yet, the town of Elmwood continued its quiet existence, as though nothing had changed. People went about their lives, avoiding the mansion at all costs but speaking little of it. The dark presence within the house had become a quiet, unsettling knowledge, a specter that hovered at the edge of their minds, but no one dared to mention it aloud. But there were whispers again. This time they came from a child. Her name was Lily, a young girl who had recently moved to Elmwood with her parents. Unlike the others, she had no idea about the house's dark history. She had no knowledge of the missing townsfolk, no warnings of the curse that had claimed so many souls. All Lily knew was that she loved to explore. And the Riley house, with its imposing architecture and eerie silence, was the perfect place for an adventure. One cold evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the town into a wash of twilight, Lily wandered closer to the house. She'd been watching it for weeks, always from a distance, her curiosity gnawing at her like a slow, insistent ache. The house called to her in ways she didn't understand, as though something inside waited for her. Lily's parents had warned her about the house. "Don't go near it," they'd told her, their voices tight with unspoken fear. But Lily didn't listen. There was a pull, a magnetic force that drew her toward it. And when her parents were busy that evening, she saw her chance. She sneaked out of the house, her small feet quiet on the damp ground as she made her way toward the towering mansion. The wind was sharp, biting at her cheeks, but she pressed on, her excitement growing as she approached the gate. The gate was old, rusted, and creaked loudly as she pushed it open. She winced at the sound but continued on. The path to the house was overgrown, with weeds growing up between the cracked stones, but Lily walked confidently. Her footsteps light, but sure. She didn't know why, but as she neared the door, she felt an odd sense of peace settle over her. The house didn't seem like a place of danger. It felt like something waiting for her, something that had been waiting for a long time. She reached out for the doorknob, her small hand trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open. The house was dark inside, but there was an unfamiliar warmth to it, as though the air itself had been warmed by the presence of something. Lily stepped inside, her eyes wide with awe and a little fear. She didn't know what drew her forward, but the deeper she went into the house, the more it seemed to call to her. The whispers began almost immediately. They weren't loud at first, just a faint murmur, a barely audible hum in the background. But as she ventured deeper into the house, they grew clearer, more distinct. They were voices, soft and desperate, and though Lily couldn't understand the words, she could feel their emotion, fear, pain, and longing. Lily pressed on, undeterred by the growing tension in the air. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. The house seemed to be alive, breathing in time with her, its walls pulsing with an energy she couldn't explain. She entered a room near the back of the house, and in the center of the room she saw something strange, a dusty old rocking chair. It creaked back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. No one was there, but the chair continued to rock, slowly, rhythmically. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She reached out toward the chair, entranced by the sight of it, as if it were calling her. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer distant but all around her, swirling in the air, demanding her attention. Leave. Leave this place. Don't stay. Lily felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the rocking chair stopped, frozen in place. Her eyes widened as she turned toward the doorway, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and dark, its presence overwhelming. Lily froze, unable to move, her heart racing as she stared at the shadow that blocked the light from the hallway. "You shouldn't have come," the figure spoke, its voice an eerie echo reverberating through the room. The figure stepped forward, and Lily gasped in recognition. It was the Whisper Keeper, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, like two endless pits. But there was something different this time. The Keeper's presence was stronger, more tangible, as if the house itself had imbued him with power. Lily stumbled backward, but the room seemed to shift around her, closing in, trapping her. The whispers grew into a cacophony, a twisted symphony of voices, all crying out in pain. Why are you here?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. The Whisper Keeper's eyes bored into her soul, and his lips curled into a twisted grin. "You are here because you belong here, child," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "Just as the others before you did." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. The house seemed to reach out for her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. "The house is not just a place, Lily," the Whisper Keeper continued. "It is a hunger. It consumes, it calls, and once you hear its voice, there is no escape." Lily struggled, but her body refused to respond. The walls closed in, the darkness growing thicker, suffocating her. "No," she cried out, but the words barely left her lips. "I won't stay here. I won't." The Whisper Keeper stepped forward, his face now mere inches from hers, his eyes empty, lifeless. "It's too late for you, child," he whispered. And then, as if the very air around her had been drained of life, everything went silent. Lily's body went limp, her mind clouded with confusion and fear. She was no longer in control. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. The Whisper Keeper stood over her, his shadow spreading across the room like a stain. And in that silence, the house seemed to breathe, its hunger momentarily sated, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, too curious, too lost. When Lily's parents noticed she had disappeared, they didn't know where to turn. The town searched, but no one spoke of the Riley house, and no one dared to look inside. Yet the house stood as it always had, waiting, watching, hungry for the next visitor, the next soul to feed its insatiable hunger. And deep inside, in the dark heart of the house, Lily's voice joined the others, whispering in the shadows, eternally bound to the cursed mansion. It had been a year since Lily's disappearance, and the town of Elmwood had learned to live with the unspoken terror of the Riley house. The town's elders, those who knew the truth of the house's curse, spoke little about it. In hushed whispers, they would warn the children to stay away from the mansion, but no one dared go near it. Still, the house stood, its walls whispering, its hunger never satisfied. But there was one person who refused to believe in the curse. David Hale, a young historian with a keen interest in the occult, had recently moved to Elmwood. He had heard the stories of Mara, of Peter, of Lily, but he wasn't one to believe in superstition. There had to be an explanation, he thought. Something rational, something that science and history could unravel. One autumn afternoon, he decided to visit the house. David had spent months studying the town's history, digging into old records, and speaking with the few residents who dared to share their experiences. His research led him to an unsettling conclusion. The house wasn't just a place haunted by the dead. It was an ancient prison, a vessel for something far older and far darker than the town's legends had ever described. He knew it was a risk. He knew that stepping inside the Riley house could change his life forever. But David was driven by an insatiable curiosity, a need to understand the truth. So, on a quiet evening when the sky was overcast and the wind howled with an eerie intensity, David made his way to the mansion. As he approached the gate, his breath caught in his throat. The house stood before him like a living entity, its dark windows staring down at him, its silhouette cutting through the stormy sky. But there was something different this time. The air was still. The house felt expectant. David didn't hesitate. He pushed open the gate, and the creaking sound seemed louder than ever before, echoing across the empty streets. The path was overgrown, the weeds clawing at his ankles. But he walked forward with purpose, each step heavier than the last. The house loomed closer, its presence wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. A chill ran down his spine, but he steeled himself. This was the moment. The truth would either free him, or it would consume him like so many before. The door opened with a low groan, and David stepped inside. The air was thick, musty with age and decay. The silence in the house was absolute, but it was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any noise. David could feel the house watching him, feeling his every move. He made his way through the darkened halls, his footsteps echoing through the empty spaces. Every so often, he would catch a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing. The house seemed to shift around him, as though it were alive, aware of his presence. David came to a small room at the back of the house, where he found a collection of strange artifacts. Old books, tarnished candles, and weathered symbols drawn on the floor. It looked like some sort of ritual chamber. And then he saw it, a worn journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. He opened it carefully, his fingers trembling as he read. The journal belonged to the first owner of the house, a man named Elias Riley. The entry spoke of dark rituals, of experiments in forbidden knowledge, and of a curse that had been sealed away long ago. But the most chilling entry was one that caught David's eye. The house is not just a home, it is a prison, and I've trapped something inside. A thing that feeds on souls, a force older than time itself. I've tried to seal it away, but it will never be fully contained. It will find a way out, and when it does, it will destroy us all. David's heart pounded in his chest. The words on the page seemed to blur before his eyes as the weight of their meaning settled upon him. The curse wasn't just a myth, it was real. Suddenly, the air around him grew heavy. The temperature dropped. He turned toward the doorway and froze. The Whisper Keeper stood in the doorway, his black eyes boring into David's soul. His form was more solid now. No longer a shadow or a flickering presence, but a towering figure, his very being radiating malice. And behind him, in the shadows, David could hear them. The voices of those who had come before. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and they were calling his name. David Hale, the Whisper Keeper intoned, his voice like the scrape of nails on stone. You've learned too much. Now you're part of the house, just like all the others. David's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The house didn't just take its victims. It trapped them, binding them to its cursed walls for eternity. The souls of those who had disappeared were still here, their voices trapped in the house, endlessly whispering, endlessly longing for release. He tried to move, to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. The air had thickened, become heavier, like an unseen force was pressing down on him. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as if they were alive, feeding on his fear. Why? Why are you doing this? David gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The Whisper Keeper's lips curled into a smile, though it was not one of joy. It was a smile of cold, unfeeling hunger. We do not choose this, David. The house chooses. The curse is eternal, and it calls to those who are curious, those who seek answers. And now, you are here. David's vision began to blur, and the house seemed to close in around him. The walls stretched and warped, the room spinning as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The voices were deafening now, a cacophony of torment that filled his ears, drowning out his thoughts. In the distance, he could see them, the souls of the lost, their faces twisted in silent screams. He reached out to them, desperate for an escape, but they faded just as quickly as they appeared. The Whisper Keeper raised a hand, and David's body froze, held in place by an invisible force. No, please, David whispered, his voice shaking. But the Whisper Keeper's eyes were unblinking, endless. He was no longer just a figure in the doorway. He was part of the house, a manifestation of its dark heart. "Welcome to your prison, David," the Whisper Keeper said softly, his voice filled with sorrow and inevitability. And as the room spun faster, as the walls caved in, David understood. The house didn't just feed on souls. It echoed Kema, twisting their essence into something new. And now, it had him, just like all the others before. Days passed. Weeks. The house stood, unchanged, waiting for the next soul to fall into its grasp. David Hale's name was added to the list. Another lost soul bound to the cursed walls of the Riley house. And in the silence of the house, the whispers never stopped. They would never stop. For as long as the house stood, the souls it had claimed would endure, trapped forever in the darkness, endlessly whispering to the next curious soul who dared to enter. The curse of the Riley house was never broken. It was only passed on. It had been 3 days since David Hale's disappearance. His colleagues and the few brave souls who knew of his search for the truth were starting to feel the weight of his absence. But in Elmwood, where time seemed to crawl, and the town's residents carried their burdens quietly, no one dared speak of the Riley house. The dark reputation of the mansion was an unspoken pact that everyone followed. Still, in the quiet, David's colleagues grew uneasy, and a few of them decided to look into the case themselves. One of them, Anna Wells, had been David's closest friend and fellow historian. She was sharp, persistent, and like David, more inclined to question the unexplained rather than dismiss it. After hearing about David's last known research and his sudden vanishing, she knew something had gone horribly wrong. Anna could feel it in her gut. The house had called to him. It had been calling to her too, for years. The whispers in the town, the strange pull whenever she passed the mansion. It was only a matter of time before she went inside. Armed with a flashlight and a journal containing David's last notes, Anna set out for the Riley house, determined to find answers and, if possible, rescue her friend. The evening was unusually still. A thick fog had settled over the town, wrapping the streets in a chilling embrace. As she approached the house, Anna felt the familiar unease crawl up her spine. But, unlike David, she wasn't deterred. She had seen enough of the strange occurrences in town to know that something dark was at play. It was time to face it, head on. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the path ahead seemed almost too quiet. The house loomed before her, its towering form casting long, dark shadows across the yard. But it wasn't the house that unnerved her. It was the air. It felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was charged with something unnatural. Anna stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaking beneath her boots. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She had read about the house's curse, the stories of those who had vanished, the countless souls trapped within. But she didn't have the luxury of fear now. David was in there, and she had to find him. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a dark hallway, the smell of dust and decay heavy in the air. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The house felt alive, the air thick with a presence that seemed to breathe alongside her. She wasn't alone. The whispers started immediately, faint at first, as though carried by the wind. But soon they grew louder, swirling around her, each voice more desperate than the last. Help. Us. Leave. Anna's heart hammered in her chest as she followed the beam of her flashlight deeper into the house. Every room she passed seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, the walls seemingly closing in on her. It was like the house itself was waiting, watching her, toying with her. She came upon the room David had described in his journal, the one with the strange symbols and the ritual objects. The room was exactly as he had written it, the remnants of ancient rites scattered around the floor. The air in this room was heavier, colder. Anna shivered as she approached the center of the room, where the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. That's when she saw it. A book, bound in black leather, lay open on the altar-like table in the center of the room. The pages were yellowed with age, but the text was still legible, written in archaic script that sent chills down her spine. She picked it up carefully, not knowing whether it was her courage or desperation that compelled her to read. As her eyes scanned the words, A cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Anna spun around, but the room remained unchanged. Only the air seemed different, charged, electric, as though something had been unleashed. The book described a ritual, one that had been performed by Elias Riley, the original owner of the house. It spoke of a dark entity trapped within the house, a being that fed on the souls of those who entered. The ritual had been meant to keep it bound forever, but something had gone wrong. The entity had grown stronger, and with each passing year it had claimed more victims. Anna's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her mind racing. The book spoke of a single word, an incantation that could undo the curse. If only it could be spoken in the right place, at the right time. But the warning was clear. Saying the word in the wrong place would set the entity free, releasing it into the world. She knew she couldn't leave without trying to free David, but she wasn't sure what the right choice was. The book's final pages were filled with warnings, each more dire than the last. And yet, Anna felt the house pushing her forward, urging her to act before it was too late. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Anna, help. She spun around, heart pounding. The voices were no longer distant. They were here, in the room with her. And in the darkness, she saw them. Shadowy figures began to materialize, their faces twisted in torment. They were the souls of the lost, their eyes empty, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The Whisper Keeper appeared before her, his gaunt face emerging from the shadows. You should have stayed away, he whispered, his voice hollow and cold. You have disturbed the balance. Anna stepped back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows around her shifted, closing in, blocking her path. She couldn't breathe. The house was alive, suffocating her. David, she cried, her voice desperate. A faint sound answered, a low, guttural moan from the corner of the room. Anna turned toward the sound, and there, slumped against the wall, was David. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a ghost. His very being seemed to be fading before her eyes, consumed by the house. Anna. David's voice was a hoarse whisper. You shouldn't have come. Anna ran to him, kneeling by his side. She tried to help him stand, but his body felt cold, lifeless. The entity had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others. You have to leave, Anna, David gasped. It's too late for me. Don't make the same mistake. But it was already too late. The Whisper Keeper raised his hand, and the shadows moved as one, encircling Anna and David. The house was awake, and it was hungry. The next morning, the town of Elmwood awoke to the same quiet stillness. David Hale and Anna Wells were never seen again. The Riley house stood as it always had, its dark windows gazing out over the town, waiting for the next curious soul to cross its threshold. The whispers never stopped. They never would. It had been weeks since Anna and David disappeared into the Riley house, and the town of Elmwood tried to go on as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted in the air. The whispers had grown louder, and the once calm streets of the town felt different, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for something. Strange occurrences began happening around Elmwood. People who had lived in the town for years began to report seeing figures at the edges of their vision, fleeting shadows darting through alleyways or standing at the windows of their homes. Pets disappeared in the night, never to return. And the children, those who dared venture too close to the mansion, spoke of hearing voices calling their names from the woods. But the strangest thing of all was the fog. It appeared every night, thick and unnatural, curling around the Riley house like an invisible hand, holding the town captive in its grip. No one dared speak of the house openly, but its presence was felt everywhere. There were whispers that the curse had spread, that the house's hunger had grown beyond its walls, reaching out to claim more victims. And in the darkest corners of Elmwood, a few of the bravest souls began to whisper something else. Something even more terrifying. The house itself was waking. It started on an ordinary evening, the air unusually heavy with anticipation. No one knew exactly when it began, but the Riley house had been different that night. The windows, once dark and empty, now glowed with an eerie light, faint and flickering like a dying fire. And in the streets around the mansion, the air was thick with the scent of something foul, decay. and the unmistakable feeling of a presence watching. Eleanor Morris, a young journalist from a neighboring town, had heard the stories about Elmwood. She had read about the mysterious disappearances in the cursed Riley house, but she had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of thing children whispered to each other around campfires. But when her editor assigned her to cover the strange happenings in Elmwood, Eleanor knew this was her chance to uncover the truth. She had arrived in the town late that afternoon, her camera and notebook in hand, ready to document whatever she could find. The streets were deserted, the few people she passed refusing to make eye contact, their heads down as if to avoid her gaze. She had heard the rumors about the Riley house, but she didn't believe in curses or haunted places. She was a journalist, a skeptic by nature, and she intended to expose the truth. As night began to fall, Eleanor made her way to the Riley house. The fog had already started to creep in from the woods, swirling around the base of the mansion, making it appear even more sinister than she had imagined. The house loomed before her, towering and ominous, its windows glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she was already here. She had to know. Eleanor reached the front door, and to her surprise, it creaked open without hesitation. The house welcomed her. Inside, the air was cold and stale, like the house had been waiting for her. The whispers started immediately, faint at first, then louder, building in intensity as though the walls themselves were alive, eager to speak. Eleanor. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but unmistakable. It wasn't one voice. It was many, all of them layered together, each whisper distinct, yet impossible to understand. She moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning under her feet as she crossed the threshold into the living room. The walls here were adorned with strange symbols, ancient runes carved into the wood. The furniture was covered in dust, abandoned long ago. But there was something about the space that felt too still. Eleanor's flashlight flickered as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Then suddenly the beam caught on something, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the darkness, was the figure she had read about in David's journal. The Whisper Keeper. His hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, his black cloak flowing like liquid shadow around him. His presence was suffocating, as if the very air had grown thicker with his arrival. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice deep and echoing, carrying the weight of ages. "But now that you're here, you will never leave." Eleanor stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. She fumbled for her camera, her hands trembling as she tried to bring it up to her face, to capture the image of the Whisper Keeper, the very thing she had come to expose. But as soon as she snapped the picture, the flash blinded her. When her vision cleared, the Whisper Keeper was gone. The room was empty. For a moment, Eleanor stood still, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it just a trick of the light? But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more urgent. "Eleanor. Eleanor." The voices called her name, each one familiar, echoing in her mind. She recognized them now. They were the voices of those who had gone missing. David, Anna, and others from the town. The ones who had become trapped within the house, their souls bound to it for eternity. And then she heard a new voice, one that made her blood run cold. "Leave now," the voice said, softer than the others but filled with fear. "Before it's too late." Eleanor turned toward the voice, and there, in the dim light, she saw him, David Hale. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his mouth moved as though he were trying to speak. But no words came out. His form flickered, like a shadow struggling to remain in this world. "David," Eleanor whispered, stepping closer. "What happened to you? What's going on here?" David's lips parted, but his voice was a mere whisper, barely audible. "It's too late. The house, it's not just a prison. It feeds on souls. It grows stronger with every soul it takes, and now it's awake. It will consume us all." The floor beneath Eleanor's feet trembled, and a deep rumble echoed through the house. She looked around, and the walls seemed to bend, distorting as if the house itself were coming to life. "We're all trapped," David continued, his voice breaking. "It's a part of us now. It will never let us go." Eleanor turned, panic rising in her chest. The door that she had come through was no longer there. The walls shifted, closing in on her, and the house began to groan with the weight of something ancient stirring. And then she understood. The house had not only taken their bodies, it had taken their spirits, their very essence, and it would keep them forever. David was only the latest in a long line of souls bound to the house. The Whisper Keeper had been right. She would never leave. The last thing Eleanor heard before the darkness took her was the sound of the whispers, now louder than ever, surrounding her from all sides. Welcome to your new home, Eleanor. The fog rolled through Elmwood once more, thick and heavy, blanketing the streets in an unnatural stillness. The Riley house stood silent, watching the town, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And so the cycle continued.